The dark red wine was thrown directly at me, the freezing liquid staining my thin silk dress like an open wound in the middle of this lavish engagement party. The place for a leech like you is in the kitchen. Marcus, the arrogant chief financial officer, my future brother-in-law, roared. His gym-built muscles flexed in triumph. He pressed his finger hard against my forehead, grinding out every word. Enough playing dress-up in the army. Step onto the grass. Let me see how many seconds a useless coward like you lasts before dropping to your knees and begging for mercy. Standing right next to him, Chloe, my own blood sister, the one I traded my blood to protect, crossed her arms, mocking me with a cruel, shrill laugh. Go ahead, sister. You are probably only good for holding babies and brooms anyway. Do not let Marcus break your fragile old bones. The crowd gasped in collective mockery. I did not cry. I did not even bother wiping the wine from my face. The afternoon wind blew my soaked coat open, caressing the jagged knife scar across my collarbone. They had no idea they had just forced a major, a chief instructor for the United States Special Operations Close Quarters System, into a corner. And they had just stripped away their own chances of walking out of here in one piece. I slowly took off my high heels, stepping my bare, heavily scarred feet onto the grass. Locking the dead hollow eyes of the Reaper onto that 200-pound black belt's throat, I gave a slight smirk, calculating exactly 4 angles to snap his tracheal cartilage in under 3 seconds. Before I show you how those 3 seconds brutally crushed his arrogance, let us pause for a moment. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if this story resonates with you. Leave a comment and let me know. Have you ever had your dignity trampled on by your own flesh and blood? And now let us step back a bit to see exactly how this bloody afternoon began. The soles of my bare feet pressed deep into the damp, dying grass. The $500 wine clung to my skin. It was freezing sticky, reeking of sharp, cheap alcohol against the torn silk. The crowd shuffled backward, forming a tight, eager ring of judgment around us. Sickly yellow light from the outdoor chandeliers threw Marcus's shadow long and heavy over my face. He stood there, rolling his massive shoulders, cracking his knuckles. The wet pops echoed over the lawn. His expensive silk shirt stretched tight across his chest, eager for violence. Near the buffet table, Eleanor Thorne raised a manicured hand to cover her mouth, whispering something vicious to Sarah Marsh. They stared at me the way one looks at a rabid, filthy animal that just wandered into a polite living room. I did not move my shoulders. I did not blink. My nervous system automatically slammed the heavy iron door shut on any useless emotions. I forced my breathing down. 1 inhale every 4 seconds. The cold oxygen hit my lungs. I was entirely awake. My eyes drifted to the diamond necklace, catching the light on Chloe's throat. 2 years ago, I was lying face down in the burning dirt of Kandahar. I chewed on stale, rock-hard rations, sending every single cent of my hazard pay directly into our mother's bank account. She told me Chloe needed an unpaid internship at a high-end fashion magazine. She said Chloe could not afford to wear cheap clothes around those wealthy people. Every single diamond resting against my sister's pulse, every fine thread stitched into Marcus's tailored suit was paid for by the nights I spent gripping a rifle in the freezing desert, swallowing my own terror. Now they used that very same wealth purchased with my blood to humiliate me in front of their friends. They called me a leech. They called me a worthless burden. A thick, bitter wave of nausea twisted at the bottom of my stomach. It tasted like ash and copper. I shifted my cold gaze toward the edge of the tent. Robert Thorne, the corporate patriarch, stood near the ice sculptures. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey and gave his son a barely visible nod. He was thoroughly enjoying this display of absolute dominance. To a ruthless businessman, the big fish eating the small fish was just the natural order of things. Then I found my father. Jonathan, a retired Marine colonel, stood completely hidden among the wealthy guests. He lowered his eyes to the floor. He rotated the heavy crystal glass in his hands, staring blankly at the melting ice cubes. He chose silence to protect the hollow illusion of a happy, unified family. I stood entirely alone inside a circle of 50 people. The real injustice was not the wine Marcus threw in my face. It was those 50 tightly shut mouths silently waiting for my spine to break so they could have some cheap entertainment with their expensive dinner. What is the matter? Legs shaking already? Marcus sneered, taking a heavy, arrogant step forward. He did not know that when he moved, his heel struck the soft earth first. His center of gravity spilled forward way too fast, dragging his balance with it. A fatal gaping hole opened right below his sixth rib. I shifted my weight, dropping my hips down a fraction of an inch. I left my bare hands hanging loose by my thighs instead of raising them to guard my face. A sudden gust of evening wind swept across the lawn. It caught the edges of my ruined coat, ripping the loose top button completely off. The small piece of plastic hit the dirt with a quiet click. In that exact fraction of a second, over by the edge of the catering tent, Ethan Thorne, Marcus's older brother, suddenly went rigid. The glass of red wine in his hand wobbled, violently spilling over his knuckles. He had just seen the thick, jagged canyon of dead flesh running down the back of my shoulder. Marcus paced in a tight circle around me. The heavy leather soles of his designer shoes crushed the scattered rose petals into the damp mud. Crack, crack. The sharp sound hammered directly into my temples, violently dragging my mind away from this suffocating garden and throwing me straight back to a freezing afternoon in November 3 years ago. The exact same rhythm. But back then, it was the screeching wheels of a hospital wheelchair grinding over a thin layer of dirty snow outside Dulles International Airport. I was sitting on the freezing concrete curb. My left leg was heavily bandaged, throbbing with a dull, sickening heat. My clothes smelled like stale sweat and dried blood. One hand gripped a splintering wooden crutch. The other held a phone with a cracked screen pressed tight against my freezing ear. The arrival lane was completely empty. Right now, the aggressive heat radiating from Marcus's tense, furious body practically suffocated the air around us. But my spine turned into a block of solid ice, frozen by that memory. Zaria, listen. Chloe and I got stuck at the mall. Wedding dress shopping is a nightmare. My mother's voice had hummed through the broken phone speaker that day. Flat, indifferent, not a single trace of worry. Just catch a cab home, okay? I will Venmo you the fare later. I'd looked down at the stiff, rust-colored stains ruining the fabric of my pants. Then I hit the red button and hung up. When I finally dragged myself through the front door later that night, Chloe did not ask how a piece of hot lead had torn through my muscle tissue. She just pinched her nose and complained that the smell of hospital antiseptic clinging to my clothes was ruining the vibe of her expensive tea party. They did not see a daughter or a sister walking through that door. They saw a broken ATM. The machine was malfunctioning, so it had better fix itself and stay out of sight so it would not dirty their pristine living room rug. A hard, bitter lump swelled in the back of my throat. I swallowed it down. The image of my late grandfather, General Arthur Marsh, flared in my mind. He was standing in his study, the air smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. His rough, calloused hand rested heavy on my 10-year-old shoulder. Family can be the most brutal place on earth. Zaria. His low voice echoed through the years. Your weapon is not your fists. It is your patience. Let them pull their own masks off. I had used that patience for 15 years. I swallowed the insults. I quietly moved out quietly, got married quietly, became a mother. I buried the lethal instincts baked into my bones, hiding them in the dark, just to buy a fake strained smile from my mother during those bland, suffocating Thanksgiving dinners. I paid for their luxury with my silence. Hey, are you falling asleep on me? Marcus's sudden bark shattered the memory. He lunged. His massive sweaty hand reached out, aiming to grab a fistful of my soaked silk collar. I stared blankly at his thick fingers flying toward my face. The sickening reality finally snapped into focus. If I kept swallowing this abuse, kept shrinking myself to keep the peace, what would happen to my little girl? Would she grow up learning to tuck her head down like a frightened turtle whenever a loud, entitled man demanded she make herself small? If I did not stand up and expose this rotting, toxic dynamic right here and now, who would do it for her? Before I show you what I did next, I have a question for you. Have you ever had to sit in silence while your own family treated you like you did not matter? If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, leave a comment below with the word survivor. And please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can support each other. The internal question detonated in my brain. My eyelids fluttered once. The overwhelming wave of childhood grief and self-pity instantly evaporated. It was entirely replaced by the freezing mechanical absolute of pure discipline. Marcus's hand was 2 inches from my neck. Marcus lunged. His heavy hand reached out, fully intending to twist my collar and throw me face first into the dirt. He used his entire upper body, relying purely on gym-built bulk and blind aggression. I did not raise my hands to block. The exact second his fingers brushed the wet silk of my coat, I slid my left bare foot exactly 6 inches backward. My center of gravity dropped instantly into my heel. I rotated my hips clockwise, riding the violent momentum he brought to me. My shoulder slipped away from his grip, like wet ice. Marcus grabbed nothing but empty air. His 200-pound frame kept moving forward, completely out of control. He scrambled to widen his stance, stumbling hard over the damp grass. He caught himself just before eating the dirt, leaning heavily on his knees, huffing out a thick, ragged breath. The surrounding crowd went dead silent. "Dumb luck!" Marcus spat, his face flushing dark red. His fragile ego was burning in front of his wealthy friends. He charged again, throwing a wild right jab straight at my face. The punch was fast, but the rhythm was painfully obvious. I did not look at his fist. I watched the thick muscle of his shoulder contracting under his shirt. A split second before his arm fully extended, I stepped off the center line at a 45-degree angle. I gently raised my right hand, pressing the outside of my wrist against his driving elbow. It required less than 5 pounds of pressure. That tiny disruption in his skeletal alignment sent his entire arm flying completely off course. The heavy punch whipped into empty air. His own momentum spun him wildly, and his back slammed violently into the thick trunk of a nearby oak tree. A hollow thud echoed across the lawn. I stayed exactly where I was. My arms hung loose by my sides. My breathing remained completely flat. Cold sweat started pooling on Marcus's forehead. He wiped his mouth, realizing something was terribly wrong. The bulky security guards he usually tossed around in his expensive Krav Maga classes obeyed the normal laws of physics. But the skinny woman standing in front of him simply refused to play by his rules. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father, Jonathan. He had finally stopped swirling his whiskey. His knuckles were bone white around the glass. He recognized that footwork. It was not a sport. It was a raw, brutal survival mechanic designed to dismantle a human body without breaking a single drop of sweat. And he knew exactly where I had to learn it. He just never wanted to acknowledge it. Humiliation morphed into blind, ugly rage. Marcus pushed off the tree, abandoning his fists entirely. He lunged forward with both hands, grabbing my left bicep. He wanted to use his absolute physical strength to twist my arm until a bone snapped. His face twisted into a mask of pure entitlement, fully expecting me to scream. This time, I did not step back. I slammed my elbow tight against my ribs, locking the joint completely. I turned my arm into a solid iron bar. He yanked backward with everything he had. Reep! The thin silk could not handle the violent tension. The sound of tearing fabric was deafening in the quiet garden. The sleeve tore violently from my shoulder all the way down to my elbow, hanging off my skin in a wet, ruined heap. Marcus's hands froze in midair. The cold evening air bit into my exposed skin. Under the fading orange light, a massive 6-inch scar was fully exposed down my bare arm. The flesh was dark, jagged, and heavily raised, leaving the unmistakable, brutal teeth marks of a serrated blade. This was not a clumsy kitchen accident. It was the permanent mark of someone who had walked out of a graveyard. Over in the corner of the garden, the soft jazz music abruptly died, replaced only by the sound of Marcus gasping for air. Over in the VIP seating area, David Vance slowly set his crystal wine glass down on the white tablecloth. His large hands that had spent 15 years stitching torn, bleeding men back together in dirt-floored medical tents overseas were trembling slightly. He stared intensely at the thick, raised scar exposed on my bare arm. He knew exactly what kind of jagged steel created a wound like that. But what actually made the hair on the back of his neck stand up was not the scar itself. It was the way I was standing. My feet were planted in a tight V shape. My chin was tucked down, perfectly shielding my windpipe. My shoulders were loose, effortlessly balancing my body weight to pivot in a fraction of a second. David's eyes widened. He realized that his future nephew-in-law was not fighting a desperate flailing woman. I was not defending myself. I was methodically operating a mechanical process designed to shut a human body down permanently. I was actively holding back just to keep Marcus breathing. A few feet away, Chloe stepped out from behind Marcus. She saw the ruined silk hanging off my arm and let out a sharp, mocking scoff. God, your cheap clothes are falling apart. You are embarrassing us, Zaria. Before the cruel words even settled in the air, a small figure shoved through the crowd of gaping adults. Lily, my 18-year-old distant cousin, ran straight toward me across the damp grass. She was holding her oversized knit cardigan. Her small hands shook as she wrapped the warm wool tightly around my exposed, scarred shoulder. Zaria, put this on. It is freezing. Lily whispered, her voice cracking with fear. She glared back at Marcus. He is insane. Do not let him bully you. I looked down at her. A distant cousin, barely more than a stranger, was the only person in this entire garden who thought to bring me a coat and an ounce of human decency. Meanwhile, my own flesh and blood stood right there, demanding to break my bones for a cheap thrill. A sudden sharp sting burned the back of my throat. It tasted like ash and swallowed tears. Over by the catering tent, Ethan Thorne took 2 slow steps forward, crossing the invisible boundary of the crowd. As a ruthless corporate executive, his brain was built to process raw data and calculate risks instantly. He stared at the violent, jagged scar. He analyzed my unnatural flat heart rate in the face of raw aggression. He remembered my vague excuses about frequent business trips out of state. Ethan looked at his younger brother, who was still gasping for air against the tree, and then he looked back at me. The arrogant, wealthy sneer had completely vanished from Ethan's face. It was replaced by a rigid, deeply cautious stare. He finally understood that Marcus had just kicked a hornet's nest he had no business touching. I placed my hand gently over Lily's trembling fingers. I gave her a small nod silently, signaling her to step back to safety. I reached down to pull the edge of the oversized cardigan tighter around my chest. As I shifted my weight, the silver chain tucked deep beneath my torn silk collar slipped out into the open air. Clink, clink. 2 rectangular pieces of dull scratched metal bumped together against my collarbone. The sound was incredibly faint, but in that dead silence it carried across the grass. They were not cheap souvenirs bought in a mall. They were authentic identification tags, their edges charred black from extreme heat wrapped in thick, worn-down black rubber silencers. The very second those 2 pieces of metal caught the yellow light of the chandeliers, David Vance shoved his heavy wooden chair backward. It crashed violently into the dirt. He stood straight up, his face draining of all color. Marcus snatched his expensive jacket off the grass. He furiously wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. Desperate to save face in front of his wealthy peers, he pointed a shaking finger right between my eyes. See that? He yelled, puffing out his chest. If I had not pulled my punch at the last second, your arm would be snapped in half right now. Stop acting tough. You learned 3 cheap parlor tricks, and now you want to ruin your sister's engagement party. Chloe instantly stepped up right beside him. The harsh, blinking flashlight of her phone camera was already pointed directly at my face. Seriously, drop it, Zaria, she sneered, holding the screen up like a shield. You always have to steal the spotlight. Would it kill you to just let Marcus have a win? Why do you always have to act so superior? The stench of a burning Cuban cigar drifted over the lawn. Robert Thorne cleared his throat. Miss Zaria, behave like a lady. His voice cut through the damp air, dripping with lazy authority. Marcus was just having a little fun. You are reacting like some unhinged street thug. This is high society. We use our words, not cheap violence. Apologize to my son and go sit down. They were rewriting reality right in front of me. The man who had just lunged at me, tearing my clothes and trying to break my arm, was magically transformed into the victim of a street thug. And I, the woman who had not thrown a single punch, was suddenly the crazy spinster ruining a beautiful family gathering. I shifted my eyes toward my own blood relatives, looking for a single ounce of defense. My Aunt Eleanor just gave a half smile, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear. She is just jealous because Chloe bagged a rich husband while she is left with nothing. A memory slammed into my chest, heavy and suffocating. I remembered sitting in a cramped, greasy diner years ago. I had a bruised jaw from the assistant manager at the hardware store. My mother sat across the sticky table, stirring her lukewarm coffee, refusing to look at me. Zariah, you have to drop the complaint. He is friends with the mayor. If you make a scene, how is Chloe supposed to get that scholarship? Cut the cord in half, but the blood only ever bleeds in one direction. They wanted me to get down on my knees. They wanted me to hand my arms over so Marcus could break them just to secure the perfect smiling family photo. The heavy lump in my throat finally shattered. I was not sad anymore. A sickening, freezing wave of disgust rose from the pit of my stomach, filling my lungs. A thick vein began to throb steadily against my left temple. Have you ever been gaslit by your own family? Have they ever tried to convince you that you were the crazy one for simply defending yourself? If you know exactly how this feels, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below with the word gaslit, so I know I am not alone in this. Seeing his father backing him up, Marcus's ego instantly inflated. He took 2 cocky steps forward. He raised his massive sweaty hand again. He aimed it down fully, intending to pat me hard on the top of my head like he was calming down a stray, disobedient dog. Come on, big sister. Be a good girl, say you are sorry, and I will let it slide. The suffocating heat of his arrogance radiated off his palm as it came down toward my skull. But this time, I did not step back. I drove my bare heel straight down into the cold mud, anchoring myself. I lifted my chin. My eyes stopped looking at his shoulders. I locked my vision dead center on the small, fragile bridge of bone resting right between his eyes. The soft jazz music playing in the background simply ceased to exist. Marcus's thick palm was 2 inches away from the top of my head. Acting on a reflex much faster than a human blink, my left arm whipped upward like a steel windshield wiper. The hard outer ridge of my forearm smashed directly into his descending wrist. Smack! The dry cracking sound of bone hitting bone rang out crystal clear. The impact was so violent that Marcus physically jerked backward. He yanked his arm to his chest, clutching his rapidly reddening wrist, his face instantly twisting in shock and sharp pain. Do not ever touch me, I hissed through my teeth. My voice was not loud, but it carried the freezing, hollow chill of an open grave. The absolute authority behind those 5 words instantly suffocated the vicious whispers of the surrounding crowd. I brushed the edge of the oversized knit cardigan aside and stood entirely straight. The sun was rapidly sinking behind the trees, turning the evening sky a bruised, bloody orange. My shadow stretched long across the damp grass, completely swallowing Marcus's shadow. I ignored the furious, bulging eyes of Robert Thorne. I stared straight through my future brother-in-law. You want a real fight? I asked, my voice flat and dead. You want to prove that women were just put on this earth for men like you to step on and throw cheap pity at? With every question I threw into the freezing air, I took 1 slow, deliberate step forward. Marcus panicked. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting frantically around the garden, desperately looking for someone, anyone, to bail him out. The dormant, suffocating authority of someone used to giving absolute orders finally woke up. It gripped the throat of everyone standing in that garden. I shifted my gaze to Chloe. Her mouth was hanging open in dumb shock. I swept my eyes over the wealthy women who had just been laughing at me. They were now physically shrinking back into the shadows of the catering tent. Fine, we will fight, I said, pronouncing every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. But I have one condition. When I win, you are going to drop down on both of your knees right here on this grass. You will apologize to me, and then you will apologize to every single woman standing in this garden for your filthy, arrogant mouth. The oxygen vanished from the lawn. I did not threaten to break his jaw. I aimed straight for the single most fragile thing he possessed, his toxic, inflated male ego. I demanded total public humiliation in front of his father's powerful friends. The crowd held their breath. Ethan Thorne shook his head slowly. Do not do it, Marcus. Just stop. He muttered, his voice tight with warning, as he finally stepped out of the shadows. But Chloe, blinded by her own stupid, desperate need for validation, shrieked at the top of her lungs. Accept it. Knock her out, Marcus. She is out of her mind. Trapped in a corner, crushed by the suffocating weight of the Thorne family pride, Marcus bit his bottom lip until a bead of dark blood swelled up. He could not back down from a single mother in a torn silk dress. His pride would not survive it. He let out a wet, guttural roar like an injured, cornered dog. "Fine, I am sending you to the hospital today," he screamed. He threw away every single rule of a friendly sparring match. He balled both of his massive hands into tight fists, his knuckles turning white. He dropped his head and charged full speed across the trampled rose petals, bringing nothing but pure, unadulterated intent to destroy. Marcus charged like a runaway freight train. He threw a wild, heavy combination left-right upper hook. I did not raise my arms to block a single one of them. My brain automatically filtered out the crowd, the lights, the entire garden. I stepped into the tunnel. Every single movement he made slowed down into fragmented frames inside my head. The heavy left punch barreled toward my face. I tilted my neck exactly half an inch to the left. The massive hook whipped through the air. I bent my knees exactly 3 centimeters. The trajectory of his fist carved nothing but harmless, empty lines through the evening air. The faster he swung, the smoother I slipped away. I moved like a ghost made of wet smoke. His 200-pound frame was doing nothing but brutally punching the empty oxygen right in front of me. 60 full seconds dragged by. I did not throw a single counterattack. I did not speak a single word. I just locked my dead hollow eyes onto his rapidly dilating pupils. The fastest way to break an arrogant man is not physical pain. It is the absolute suffocating despair of realizing he cannot touch you. Marcus's breathing started to violently break apart. He sounded like a punctured bellows, wheezing and choking on his own exhaustion. The sour, sharp stench of panic sweat soaked right through the back of his expensive silk shirt. The air around him stank of complete, undeniable failure. My absolute flat silence acted as a brutal mirror reflecting his pathetic weakness right back into his face. He was drowning on dry land, and his own family was standing right there watching him sink. Desperate, he threw a heavy looping roundhouse kick. It was a sloppy, exhausted move, completely devoid of balance. Before his foot even left the grass, I took a tiny step inside his guard. I dropped my shoulder just enough to bump the inside of his pivoting leg. It was barely a nudge, but it completely shattered his center of gravity. Marcus lost his footing entirely. He stumbled backward 3 heavy steps, catching himself on his knees, gasping for air. Nobody in the crowd dared to make a sound. The bulky security guards who had clapped for him earlier just stood there, their mouths hanging slightly open. The expensive, flashy black belt status he had bragged about all afternoon was ground into cheap dust, using nothing but simple footwork. His toxic, entitled male ego shattered right there on the dying grass. Humiliation instantly boiled into pure insanity. Marcus looked up from the dirt. The whites of his eyes were webbing with thick, angry red veins. He no longer wanted to teach me a lesson. He wanted to erase me from existence. He could not stand the thought of a woman walking away with his pride. Throwing away every last ounce of restraint or safety, he backed up to build momentum. He channeled every remaining drop of physical power in his heavy body, throwing his entire weight into a violent 360-degree spin. He unleashed a blind spinning back elbow aimed directly at my temple. It was not a move designed to win a friendly spar. It was a mechanical motion designed to permanently shut down a human brain. The heavy bone of his elbow ripped through the cold evening air, creating a sharp, sickening whistling sound as it flew toward my skull. "No!" David Vance screamed in absolute terror. The heavy bone of Marcus's elbow ripped through the cold evening air. It was aimed directly at my temple. Operating entirely on muscle memory, I locked my neck muscles tight. My right hand curled into a heavy fist, preparing to drive straight up into his windpipe, but I did not have to throw the punch. A massive, towering shadow swept across my face, moving faster than a heartbeat. My father, Jonathan Marsh, finally shattered his cowardly silence. His huge, calloused hand shot out, snatching Marcus's swinging wrist right out of mid-air. The brutal momentum of a 200-pound man spinning at full speed was instantly crushed against my father's iron grip. Using a cold mechanical twist of his wrist, my father bent Marcus's arm violently behind his back. Snap! The sickening sound of a joint popping echoed over the grass. Marcus let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek. The strength drained completely out of his legs, and he collapsed heavily onto the damp dirt. My father pressed a heavy hand down on his shoulder, pinning him there. He had spent 15 years staring at his shoes to keep the peace in this family. But right now, the retired Marine was fully awake. "You dare use a kill shot on my daughter right in front of me," my father growled. His voice rolled across the lawn like a low crack of thunder. This was not a sloppy fistfight. This was absolute, undeniable punishment. The entire garden plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. Chloe clamped both hands over her mouth, screaming in pure horror, her expensive makeup running down her face. Over by the catering tent, Robert Thorne froze completely. The heavy crystal whiskey glass slipped through his fingers and shattered into 100 pieces on the stone patio. Through that terrifying silence, David Vance stepped out from the VIP seating area. He did not even bother to look at his own nephew weeping on the ground. His eyes were fixed entirely on me, carrying a heavy weight of deep respect and quiet sorrow. He turned, sharply glaring right at Robert Thorne and the crowd of gasping, pale-faced socialites. "Are all of you completely blind?" Vance's voice boomed over the lawn. "Look closely at that scar. Look at her stance. You arrogant fools have spent the entire afternoon mocking one of the greatest warriors this country has ever produced." Every word he spoke hit the crowd like a sledgehammer. Vance pointed a stiff finger directly at me, tearing away the last shred of my disguise. "This is not some useless leech. This is Major Zariah Marsh, a living legend, chief instructor of hand-to-hand systems for the United States Special Operations. She has been stepping back and pulling her punches because she was trying to protect this broken, ungrateful family, not because she was afraid of pathetic parasites like you." The truth hit the garden like a bomb. The wealthy women who had laughed at my torn clothes physically recoiled, the blood draining entirely from their faces. Ethan Thorne bit his bottom lip, slowly lowering his head in a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect. Have you ever had a moment where the truth finally came out and the people who looked down on you were forced to eat their own words? If you know the exact feeling of ultimate vindication, please hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment down below with the word justice, so we can celebrate that feeling together. The toxic illusion of the Thorne family wealth and the cheap, arrogant assumptions about weak, defenseless women were ground into fine dust under the darkening sky. The wind blew across the lawn, rustling the torn silk hanging off my arm. Everyone was staring at me. They were completely paralyzed, waiting for the reaper to collect her due. The manicured garden had completely transformed into a psychological graveyard. Robert Thorne stood completely mute near the shattered remains of his whiskey glass. The blood had entirely drained from his face. The overwhelming humiliation of watching his corporate heir attempt to murder a decorated national hero was suffocating him. The wealthy women who had eagerly joined in to mock my cheap clothes were now physically shrinking away, terrified to even breathe too loudly. Chloe stood frozen like a broken doll. Thick black streams of expensive mascara ran down her pale cheeks, completely ruining her flawless makeup. Her shallow arrogance, built entirely on a rich fiancé and designer labels, had just been brutally crushed under the weight of my reality. She finally understood. I was never a shadow for her to step on. I was a mountain she could never climb. My father slowly released his iron grip on Marcus's shoulder and took one heavy step backward. I walked forward, stopping just inches away from where Marcus was hunched over in the damp dirt. I did not raise my hand to strike him again. He simply was not worth getting my hands dirty. "Keep your promise," I said. My voice was entirely flat. It carried the absolute, uncompromising authority of someone who had spent her entire adult life giving orders that could not be questioned. 4 simple words. But they carried the crushing weight of a death sentence. Marcus jerked his head up. His eyes were wide, frantic, and leaking tears of pure panic. He looked desperately over my shoulder toward the catering tent, begging his father for help. But Robert Thorne slowly turned his back. The patriarch walked away, abandoning his son to protect his own remaining shred of dignity. Marcus had been completely discarded by his own bloodline. Shaking violently, Marcus slowly dragged his right knee through the mud and then his left. He lowered both of his knees onto the dying grass. He dropped his head down, staring at the crushed rose petals between my bare feet. I am sorry," he choked out. His voice was cracked, hollow, and utterly pathetic. "I apologize to you, and I apologize to all the women here today. for my own stupidity. His pathetic apology vanished into the cold evening air, acting as the ultimate indictment against his toxic, inflated male ego. The absolute humiliation was far more brutal than any physical blow I could have ever delivered. The fake power he wore like a cheap suit had been stripped away completely. Watching her perfect, wealthy future husband weeping on his knees in the dirt, Chloe finally broke. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the grass, sobbing hysterically into her hands. I did not offer him a single word of forgiveness. I did not even look at my sister. I turned my head and gave my father a slow, silent nod, a quiet acknowledgement that he had finally stood on the right side of history. I reached out and gently squeezed Lily's trembling shoulder, thanking the only person in this family who actually saw me as a human being. Slowly, methodically, I slipped my bare, scarred feet back into my high heels. I pulled the oversized wool cardigan tighter around my torn silk dress, shielding the cold wind from my skin. Leaving the hysterical sobbing, the broken glass, and the terrified stares behind me, I turned my back on the garden. I walked straight toward the heavy iron gates of the estate. The cold evening air rushed into my lungs. My chest felt entirely weightless. The suffocating 15-year-old chain tying me to this toxic, ungrateful family had finally snapped. I did not just walk out of a party, I walked out of their lives forever. 3 months later, the heavy mail carrier dropped a stack of envelopes into my aluminum mailbox with a metallic clatter. I never received a wedding invitation from Chloe, and honestly, I did not care. Through a few quiet texts from Lily, I found out that Marcus had been permanently stripped of his position as chief financial officer. His father quietly removed him from the board, citing a severe inability to manage risks. His career took a massive dive. Word around town was that he had become completely withdrawn, easily startled, and violently flinched anytime someone simply mentioned my name. Chloe's perfectly curated social media accounts went completely dark. There were no more flashy photos of designer bags or expensive dinners. Their fake suffocating arrogance had been permanently buried under the damp grass of that garden. My mother eventually sent a 3-page apology letter stuffed with old family Polaroids. I opened it. I read every single word. Then I folded it neatly and shoved it into the deepest corner of my bottom desk drawer. Forgiveness is a quiet process, but it does not mean handing the knife back to the people who cut you. I was not ready to let her back in, and I refused to compromise my sanity just to maintain a hollow family image. But in exchange for that loss, every Sunday afternoon, a heavy pickup truck pulled into my driveway. My father, Jonathan, would step out. He spent hours sitting quietly on my wooden front porch, drinking black coffee and building wooden blocks with his granddaughter. He never pushed for answers. He just sat there. The deep, ugly fractures in our relationship were slowly healing. Not through forced, loud apologies, but through quiet, undeniable respect. Standing in the center of my living room, the warm morning sunlight poured through the open windows, completely filling the space. The air smelled of fresh laundry and sweet baby powder, washing away the lingering memories of stale wine and burning cigar smoke. I leaned down and scooped my little girl up into my arms. She giggled, reaching her tiny soft fingers out to gently trace the thick, jagged scar running down my bare shoulder. I held her warm body tight against my chest. I looked up at the large mirror hanging above the fireplace. I did not see an exhausted, broken woman looking back at me. I did not see a cold, mechanical weapon built to survive the absolute worst of humanity. Staring back at me in the reflection, I saw the steady, quiet shadow of General Arthur Marsh, smiling in approval. He was right. The strongest weapon a woman possesses is her patience. But that patience must be placed in the right hands. The heavy raised scars on my body proved that I had survived the darkest, most violent corners of this world. But walking out of those iron gates that evening proved something much harder. I had finally conquered the suffocating darkness of my own family. Absolute power does not need to scream to be heard. True respect is never bought with diamond necklaces or loud, arrogant threats. It is built entirely on a foundation of dignity that simply cannot be broken. Sometimes the most lethal, devastating weapon a human being can possibly wield is total, unbreakable silence. Our story ends here today. But I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to be completely ruthless and cut off a toxic family member just to protect your own peace? How did it feel when you finally walked away? Leave a comment down below and share your experience. Thank you so much for listening, for subscribing, and for supporting this channel. Until next time, stay strong, know your worth, and take care of yourselves.